Hi, I'm Emily Marchini, and this is Lecture 7, the North American Model of Wildlife Conservation and the Public Trust Doctrine and Market Hunting. I apologize in advance, I am a little bit sick, so that's why I sound nasally and gross. For the overview, I will be going over chapters 13 and 14 in the North American Wildlife Policy and Law textbook. Chapter 13 goes over the Public Trust Doctrine, the North American Model of Wildlife Conservation, which has 7 principles. I've also seen them be called tenets. I don't think the order actually matters, since I've seen them in different orders in other texts with slightly different wording, but they all have the same meaning. So the first principle is wildlife resources are a public trust. The second principle is markets for game are eliminated. The third principle is allocation of wildlife is by law. The fourth principle, wildlife can only be killed for legitimate purposes. 5, wildlife is considered an international resource. The sixth principle is science is the proper tool to discharge wildlife policy. And finally, the 7th principle, which is democracy of hunting is standard. There's a few criticisms and defenses that the text touches on, so I'll go over that as well. And chapter 14 covers market hunting, the Lacey Act of 1900, the Black Bass Act of 1926, and then the evolution of these acts and what they mean today. So the North American Model of Wildlife Conservation was created by Valerius Geist when he was the chair of Faculty of Environmental Design at the University of Calgary. He was a wildlife scientist with German, Russian, and Canadian upbringing, so he knew of different countries and their conservation policies. The model is based on the Public Trust Doctrine, which came from an 1842 Supreme Court ruling in Martin versus Waddell that I'll go over in the next slide. Basically, the Public Trust Doctrine says that says that the states hold wildlife in trust for the benefit of current and future generations, except in certain circumstances where the federal government has jurisdiction. There are 7 principles of the model. And there were a few iterations initially focused on public ownership of wildlife, no market for game species and non-game bird parts and products, prohibiting frivolous killing of wildlife, and allocating the benefits of wildlife by law, and eventually added in the final 2 principles. And these principles support the laws, attitude, beliefs, and regulations that distinguish the North American system from other countries. So the first principle is wildlife resources are a public trust, and this means that the government holds wildlife in trust for the benefit of the public, which needs no special status to be a beneficiary. Public ownership of wildlife provides legal grounding for federal, provincial, and state agencies. In Canada, rights were granted based on case laws stemming from public access disputes. In the U.S., Martin versus Waddell in 1842, where landowner William C.H. Waddell claimed exclusive rights over oysters on mudflats in New Jersey because his ancestor, the Duke of York, was granted rights to the land and water from King Charles II in 1664 and 1674. Justice Roger Taney questioned what right did the king have to grant ownership of resources for private use. And an English law did not like ownerless things, so public resources were put in the king's ownership as a trustee and not for personal use. And this law applied to the American colonies, but after independence, there was no king to be trustee, so in Martin versus Waddell, trustee status was given to the states. And trustee status is transferred to the federal government when wildlife falls under jurisdiction of the U.S. Constitution. And the second principle is market for game are eliminated. Unregulated market hunting caused near extinction of many species for hide, meat, pelts, and feathers. This image over to the right, I believe, is passenger pigeons. And as you know from every other lecture you've ever watched, passenger pigeons, there used to be millions or billions of them, and now they are extinct. And then other species such as the bison were almost hunted to extinction, and there's tons of other examples of that. So federal and state laws, such as the Yellowstone National Park Protection Act of 1894, the Lacey Act of 1900, which we'll go over later, and the Adirondack Deer Law in 1897, tried to curb poaching and eliminate market hunting. These changes came about because markets for meat and other animals parts emphasize the value of dead wildlife, where markets that are based on wildlife viewing and fair chase emphasize the value of live wildlife. And then Chapter 13 says prohibiting wildlife trafficking took value away from dead wildlife. However, I'm not sure if I entirely agree with this statement because poaching is still an issue. Not so much in the US, but in other places where like the pangolin is, very trafficked. And there are issues all across Africa with poaching there. But we do have poaching in the US. It's just might not be as prevalent as in other countries where there's basically a market for it because the people who live in those areas, they might not have resources to, have other jobs. So it's an easy way for them to make a little bit of money to feed their families. And as for exceptions, there's obviously always going to be exceptions to this. So fur bearers were the exception, and the fur market is highly regulated and serves conservation purposes. Perhaps in the case of the beaver, which is an ecosystem engineer, which can lead to human-wildlife conflicts, and maybe we don't want dams all over everywhere. So that is why there are some exceptions to fur markets. The third principle is allocation of wildlife is by law, and this means that wildlife is allocated by law rather than birthright, land ownership, or other special privileges, with the exception of Aboriginal people. Wildlife resources are allocated by seasons. So there are closed seasons, usually in the spring when there's young, and then the dates, some change each year while others open and close on the same day every year. And season length, some species have long seasons. For deer here in New York, in my region, which is on Long Island, we just opened up a 9-day September season. And our regular season goes from October 1st through December 31st. And then we also have a special firearm season that starts on the first Sunday in January and goes until January 31st. But for another species, such as wild turkey, we only have a 2-week fall season and a weekend spring hunt for youth. So we don't have a long season for turkey in the spring, where other parts of the state you can hunt turkey in the spring, but here you can't. So it can change from state to state, and it can even vary greatly within each state. For bag limits, different species of waterfowl have different bag limits based on how their populations are doing, and this can vary by region. And then certain places you need certain tags to harvest things. So some places you're allowed to harvest, like in my region, once again, we have basically unlimited antlerless deer take just because we have an overpopulation issue. So that's not necessarily the same everywhere. So once again, bag limits vary region to region and state to state. Methods, I believe this is the manner of take, so either firearm, a bow, or a crossbow, and protection. So certain species are not allowed to be harvested at all. And the public can participate and provide input during public comment periods, and the public process is complicated. Agencies have been criticized for catering to hunters since they provide most funds, which is why transparency, fairness, and inclusivity are very important. The fourth principle is wildlife can only be killed for legitimate purposes. Wildlife is protected from wanton killing, and there are circumstances in which wildlife can be taken. So you can't just, kill a chipmunk just because you're bored. Hunting of certain species is allowed, but there are also animals that can be taken if they are a nuisance, damaging property, or threatening public safety. I'm sure everyone could think of an example of how an animal has threatened public safety, and usually it's due to human interactions, like this article that by Dickinson 2021. It's from Stanley Park in Vancouver, Canada, where there are about 30 coyote attacks on humans since December of 2020. I believe this article was published in July of 2021, so only 7-ish months. and they were able to track the coyotes, and then they made the choice to euthanize them because it was unsafe for park goers. And then the other, these two kind of combine, but not entirely, to lead to what is known as the Code of the Sportsman. So I had a little difficulty finding what the Code of the Sportsman is, but I was able to find it in Argonne et al. 2012. And this code instills the value of what good sportsmen should be. So a person who is hunting should be doing it for the pursuit or the chase. So it doesn't matter if an animal is harvested or not. It's more kind of being out and enjoying, not necessarily enjoying, but being in nature. And the end goal is not to harvest an animal, although that is a goal. It's not like the end all be all. And then the person who hunts should be giving fair chase. So that's giving the animal the opportunity to flee and not, trapping it or unfairly cornering it somehow. Kind of making the animal able to outsmart you. And then the sportsman should have knowledge of nature and habitat. So they should know about the environment. They should know where to go, where to find the game that they're looking for. Perhaps they should know, certain species of plants, maybe not walking on protected habitat or a plant of concern. And then the sportsman should not have any financial gain from killed game. So the hunter is not selling the meat or the animal parts. There are guides, which I don't think that they're not gaining from selling meat. They are financially gaining from providing a service to somebody to either take them out on a hunt or something like that. But there shouldn't be any sale of animal parts. And then I think it's most important that there is no unnecessary pain or suffering, and any sportsman should know where to aim and when to take the shot. And if you don't have a shot that will put the animal down quick, you shouldn't take the shot. And finally, the sportsman does not waste anything that is killed. If you take the animal's life, you make sure to use all the parts that you can, and if you can't use them, give them to someone else who can. The fifth principle is wildlife is considered an international resource. Early on, Canada and the United States realized the need for international management of waterfowl and migratory birds, and they signed the Migratory Bird Treaty in 1916. This treaty was amended in 1918, and it states, this is kind of long, so I apologize, establishment of a federal prohibition, unless permitted by regulations, to pursue, hunt, take, capture, kill, attempt to take, capture or kill, possess, offer, for sale, sell, offer to purchase, deliver for shipment, ship, cause to be shipped, deliver for transportation, transport, cause to be transported, carry, or cause to be carried by any means whatever, receive for shipment, transportation or carriage, or export at any time or in any manner any migratory bird included in the terms of this convention, for the protection of migratory birds, or any part, nest, or egg of any such bird. And that is 16 USC 703, and then Section 3H of the Fish and Wildlife Improvement Act of 1978 granted Alaskan natives permits to take migratory waterfowl during established seasons, and federally recognized tribes to use bald eagle feathers in religious and cultural purposes. So that was kind of a lot. So basically, you can't kill, attempt to take, capture, possess migratory birds unless they're in a season, and you can't own any part, nest, or egg of any such birds. And basically the only exceptions to that rule are for I believe they're federally recognized tribes who can apply for permits to own or possess bald eagle or golden eagle feathers to use in their religious and cultural ceremonies. So that was just Canada and the United States from 1819 until 1936 when Mexico joined the treaty, and that was followed by Japan in 1972 and Russia in 1976. And after World War II, the world was very different, with international commerce being easier, and thankfully policymakers were concerned about the impact new industries could have on wildlife and plant species conservation. 80 nations signed the Convention of International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, also known as CITES or CITES, I say CITES, in 1973. And by 2017, 183 nations were in on the agreement. And that law section, I cited it in the literature cited section. So if you're interested in looking at that, it is there for you. And the sixth principle is science is the proper tool to discharge wildlife policy. So policymakers cannot be expected to have an in-depth understanding of every single biological system on top of all the other policies they need to make decisions on that are totally not wildlife related at all. And that's why it's so important to have wildlife managers and researchers who are on the ground collecting the data on biological systems and monitoring them while evaluating the management impacts. And since there is a distrust in science, everyone involved must be objective, transparent, and make decisions based on facts. And finally, the seventh principle is democracy of hunting is standard. Theodore Roosevelt thought that hunting would benefit American society because it would teach people to be self-reliant. Aldo Leopold believed that democracy of sport would distinguish North American approach from other countries because it is so different. In Central Europe in the 1800s, feudal lords held hunting rights in common forests, and the peasants were excluded from this right. In Germany, hunting is managed on economic and landholding basis, not on a democratic basis. In Africa, trophy animals are reserved for tourists who spend lots of money to harvest wildlife there. In the United States and Canada, hunting is available to all as long as you purchase a license and have the correct tags and privileges. Being in-state, like I know in-state in New York, residents have a lower fee for their license, and out-of-state, or not in-state residents, I guess they would be out-of-state residents, they have a higher fee to purchase tags. And I believe it's the same in almost every state. So in-state citizens or residents kind of have a leg up, but not necessarily. It's just that their fees are just a little bit cheaper, I guess, to give those people kind of a benefit. Because in some places, like where you can harvest moose, there are, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of like not a raffle, but or a lottery system. So there are some spots that are reserved for in-state people, and then out-of-state people can have an opportunity to harvest. But since there's probably more people competing for out-of-state than in-state, depending on where you are. So it gives the residents kind of a leg up because they're the ones that are there with the wildlife. So, but everyone can purchase a license. It doesn't really matter. Just, once again, one will be higher than the other. Okay, and so hunting and hunters have played a huge role in wildlife conservation in North America, and policies were formed around issues related to hunting, like overhunting and market hunting, and opportunity to participate in hunting. And those who promoted the concerns were also hunters. Today, hunters make up only about 7% of the U.S. population, but they still play a crucial role in conservation. Like many of you know, the Pittman-Robertson Act generates like an excise tax, so that tax on hunting gear, firearms, ammunition is kind of piled up and given to wildlife agencies across, like every state gets it. So most of the money for wildlife conservation is coming from hunters. But obviously there can't be a model that everyone is entirely happy with, and that includes the 40% of the population that participates in wildlife-related activities, but not necessarily hunting. So there are criticisms to the North American wildlife conservation model, and some of them are criticisms that it only pertains to game species. While this is untrue, It can appear that way because the application to non-game species is uneven or inadequate, and certainly that's something that could be improved. Another criticism is that the model is narrow and not inclusive because of the funding source. However, funding is not part of this model. Nowhere does it say anything about money in any of the principles. And then there's the model that is not full or accurate portrayal of conservation history, which it was never presented as the full history. It was only focused on relevant historical developments. And finally, it's prescriptive and intended to strictly guide future conservation efforts, but it's not a prescription or formula for the future. It is just a representation of policies that the wildlife conservation in North America developed from. And so that's it for chapter 13, and now we'll move on to chapter 14. So I'll give you a little overview of overharvesting and like what kind of led to it. So when settlers first arrived in North America, the land probably seemed untouched due to how the Native Americans cared for it. While Native Americans did not have traditional laws or rules governing the take of natural resources, they relied on the habitat, plants, and animals around them for sustenance and spirituality. So it was in their best interest to conserve these resources. So they, would have them for future use. They were a little bit more in touch with nature than settlers were, so the way that they interacted with the land and the animals was obviously going to be different. So settlers, on the other hand, they were coming from Europe, where natural resources were owned by the powerful and the wealthy. And in this new landscape, hunting was necessary for survival, and all except for slaves had the right to hunt. So this kind of leads to, if you're a super strict parent, and then you have super strict parents, and you go off to college and you kind of go crazy because you don't know what to do with all of this newfound freedom that you have. So it's kind of how it was for the settlers when they came to North America, because they were like, whoa, what is all this stuff? Like, we could just do whatever we want. And so some of these people were better at hunting and fishing than others, so they were able to utilize those skills to form businesses. So they would hunt and they would fish, and then they would sell the meats to others in the community. And unfortunately, there were hardly any laws in place to prevent overharvesting, except Portsmouth, Rhode Island, had a closed white-tailed deer season dating back to 1646. And that was pretty much it for laws at that time. And then no laws coupled with new modes of transportation and preserving food, people were able to harvest wildlife, and they were able to can them, preserve them, tan the hides, do whatever they needed to do, and they were able to ship them back to the big cities where there was a high demand for it, because as cities started developing, there's less wildlife inside the city, so there's less opportunity for the people to harvest their own. So there's a huge demand for meat. And then simultaneously, the government was actively trying to decimate Native Americans, and in doing so, millions of bison were slaughtered. As you can see on this picture to the left, this is a man standing there with a wall of bison skulls behind him. So these animals were slaughtered in the millions, and if anything was taken from them, I believe it was their tongue, but then the rest of the carcass was left to rot on the plains. So yeah, they were pretty successful in trying to decimate the bison and also the Native Americans in the area. So George Bird Grinnell was an editor of the Forest and Stream magazine when bison were being slaughtered, and he realized that there needed to be regulations to stop overharvesting fish and wildlife species. He founded the Audubon Society in 1886, which led to the National Audubon Society in 1902. He was friends with Theodore Roosevelt and supported the creation of the Boone and Crockett Club in 1887. His writings and participation in these clubs made him politically powerful. I personally didn't know much about him other than the fact that there's a college in Iowa named after him, and I only knew that because I worked with somebody who went there. But I tried to find a brief documentary about him, but I didn't really have much luck. So I've included a short YouTube video from his induction to the Wyoming Outdoor Hall of Fame, and that gives a brief overview of his life and work. So Iowa Congressman John Fletcher Lacey introduced the Lacey Act in 1900, and that was the first federal law to protect wild game and birds. And this act was intended to supplement existing state laws to protect wildlife. Excuse me. However, this was not the first time he tried to introduce a bill regarding wildlife. I believe this was his third try. The others were shot down, but this one finally made it through. And this act made it illegal to transport illegally harvested game and wild birds across state lines. To me, that seems a little bit obvious, because if it was illegally taken, then how could it be illegal to transport an illegally harvested animal? But I guess you need to have it written into law. It also prohibited the introduction of certain non-native exotic species into native ecosystems. I don't know about you, but where I live, there are tons. Almost every species is non-native, so I'm not sure how well that one actually worked. And it also strengthened existing state laws by providing a federal backstop with respect to interstate movement of wild game and birds. Lacey did not intend this to be a national game law, which he believed would be unconstitutional. But after reading the Constitution, I don't really know how this would be unconstitutional, but whatever. And in 1901, there were 2 incidents regarding illegal wild game that authorities were able to charge the perpetrators based on the Lacey Act. So 48 men in Illinois shipped 22,000 grouse, quail, and ducks into the state. I assume they were already dead, harvested elsewhere, and, brought in to sell. And then in New York, 40,000 illegally traded game birds were found. So the Lacey Act was a solution to end legal commercialization of natural resources. I'm sure there are tons and tons and tons of examples of these, but basically it shows almost immediately after being enacted, they were able to actually do something about the people that were illegally harvesting wildlife. So the Isaac Walton League of America was formed in 1922 by 54 sportsmen who were concerned about the forests, wetlands, and waterways. And at the time, federal and state agencies tried to combat the dwindling fish stocks by hatcheries, so hatching fish and restocking them. But the Isaac Walton League of America thought that pollution and habitat loss were to blame, so they started the discussion about unregulated commercial use of fish. Missouri Congressman Harry Hawes introduced the Black Bass Act of 1926, which was signed into law that year by President Calvin Coolidge. This act was modeled after the Lacey Act of 1900. It targeted commercial harvest and overharvest of fish, specifically black bass, largemouth bass, and smallmouth bass. It also prohibited sale of illegally caught fish in one state and sold in another. Once again, seems kind of obvious. But has to be written into law, I suppose. And it gave federal protection to state protection and strengthened the state's ability to conserve their fish resources. And the Bureau of Fisheries was responsible for enforcing the act. However, initially Congress did not approve the funds, so it was likely difficult for the organization to actually do their jobs. But eventually those funds were approved. So this part of the chapter was difficult for me because it was just kind of like jumping between the acts. So I hope this is helpful to you, and I apologize in advance for the dense wall of text, but this is the only thing I could think of to do to try to sort it out for my own brain. Okay, so in 1930, the Tariff Act was passed, which prohibited importation of any bird or mammal illegally taken in or exported from a foreign nation. In 1935, the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Bureau of Biological Survey was in charge of the Lacey Act, which was amended to incorporate the transportation provisions of the Black Bass Act, and also commerce of wildlife species that were illegally taken were prohibited. In 1939, the U.S. Department of Interior was authorized to enforce the Lacey Act as well as the Black Bass Act. In 1940, the Bureau of Biological Survey and the Bureau of Fisheries became the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. In 1949, the Lacey Act prohibited the importation of wild animals and birds under inhumane and unhealthful conditions. In 1969, the Lacey Act was expanded to prohibit the transport of illegally taken amphibians, reptiles, and mollusks and crustaceans. However, migratory game birds were removed since they were covered by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. All penalties were raised to $10,000 and up to 1 year in prison. And in the 70s, the Endangered Species Act and CITES happened, which kind of complicate the reach of both the Lacey and the Black Bass Acts. In 1981, Congress repealed both the Lacey Act and the Black Bass Act and replaced them with the Lacey Act amendments of 1981. Migratory birds came back under the jurisdiction of the Lacey Act amendments, and indigenous plants were added. So penalties were increased for infringement, so $10,000 for a maximum misdemeanor conviction and a maximum civil fine, and $20,000 for a maximum felony conviction. The term willfully was removed from criminal violations, so it was just knowingly. And in 1988, guides and outfitters became liable for their clients' illegal activities under the Act, and the most recent updates are from the 2008 Farm Bill, which now focus on illegally harvested timber. And Congress prohibited the import, export, and transport and sale of all protected plants. The current penalties are a maximum civil fine of $10,000. Maximum misdemeanor fines are $100,000 per individual and $200,000 per organization, and or up to 1 year imprisonment. And criminal convictions, it's a $250,000 fine per individual and a $500,000 fine per organization, and or up to 5 years imprisonment. So for the Black Bass Act amendments in 1930, Congress prohibited the transport and receipt of illegal bass shipments and required fish shipments across state lines to be labeled, and the Bureau of Fisheries finally received funds to enforce the Black Bass Act. And keep in mind, this act was signed into law in 1926, so for about 4 years, not much was able to be done. And like the Lacey Act, in 1939, enforcement of the Black Bass Act was given to the Department of the Interior. In 1947, all game fish as defined by state law were covered under the Act, and in 1952, that expanded to cover all fish species. And in 1981, the Lacey Act and the Black Bass Act were repealed and replaced with the Lacey Act amendments of 1981 that I just went over in the previous slide. So for the summary, the North American model of wildlife conservation is not perfect, but it was created to try to protect wildlife while also allowing citizens to use the resources. And the Lacey Act of 1900 was the first federal law to protect wild game and birds, and it's been amended many times over the years to fit modern times. And the Black Bass of 1926 was modeled after the Lacey Act of 1900 and focused on fish, and it too has been amended over the years. So here are the questions for the exam, and the literature cited, and finally the discussion. So for this week's discussion, we'll read and annotate this article, Why the North American Model of Conservation is Problematic for Modern Wildlife Management, by Peterson and Nelson and Perusal. I think it just shows a different perspective of the model. You know, when we're reading the text, it kind of makes it seem like this is the best we can do. So maybe you can get a different perspective from these authors and see, just once again, just a different perspective about how this model could be tweaked to fit modern times, and maybe get a better understanding for like how we could go forward. So that's it for my presentation. Thank you for watching.